missionary one time approached me, and he had his Bible with him. It was full with little notes that he had penciled in on the side. There were sticky papers all over, sticking out all over the place. This was a well-used Bible, and he approached me and he said, "Excuse me, sir, you're Jewish, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I am Jewish." And he said, "Well, I have the Jewish Bible with me right here. I have a translated Jewish Bible, and I have a passage over here in the book of Isaiah which tells me that Jesus is the Messiah predicted by the Jewish prophets. Why don't you believe as I do? Why don't you believe that Jesus is the Messiah predicted by your own prophets?" So I looked the missionary in the eye and I said, Isaiah was a false prophet." So he took a step back. He said, "Do you mean to say Isaiah was a false prophet? What kind of a Jew are you? Don't the Jews believe that Isaiah was a true prophet and they actually read from the book of Isaiah in their synagogues on a regular basis?" So I said, "I was joking with you. Of course Isaiah was a true prophet. God forbid, I would never say that Isaiah is a false prophet. But I would ask you the following question. How do you know that Isaiah was a true prophet? I know how I know that Isaiah was a true prophet. But how do you, the Christian, know that Isaiah was a true prophet?" And let me take that question one step further. You're going to tell me now that I have to move my life or change my life on the basis of this book. That means that this book is God's directive to me, telling me that you should move your life in this direction or that direction because God said so. God would have to provide a method of telling me that this book is authentic, that Isaiah was a true prophet, he really lived, and that these are his words. What method did God set in place to tell me that Isaiah was really a true prophet? How did God expect me to come to that information? And this is what I asked the missionary. "So you tell me, how do you know that Isaiah was a true prophet?" So he started telling me, well, some of his prophecies were fulfilled. It fits in with the rest of Scripture. I said, let's step back. I shouldn't ask you how you know, but I should rather ask you, what method did God expect you to use? I want you to point to the Bible and show me in the Bible how God expects us to identify a true prophet and separate the true prophets from the frauds. Because both you and I acknowledge that there are people out there claiming to be true prophets, and they are not. The Christians and Jews will both say, well, the fellow who predicted that the world's coming to an end on May 21st it was a fraud, right? So how are we supposed to know that he's a fraud? How are we supposed to know that Muhammad was not a true prophet? Both Christians and Jews accept that Muhammad was not a true prophet, yet we both are supposed to accept that Isaiah was a true prophet. What method did God set in place to teach us this very important message? And the Christian missionary I was speaking to was actually at loss. He didn't really have an answer to my question. But I'll give you the answer to the question. The answer to the question is, if you look in Deuteronomy 13, verses 2 through 6, God clearly commands us about how it is that we are supposed to evaluate a claim to prophecy. What we're supposed to do when a fellow comes along and says, "I am a true prophet," and this fellow comes and performs a sign or a wonder. Now, when we say the claimant to prophecy performs a sign or a wonder, that means he produced a miracle. It doesn't say what type of miracle. It could be any miracle. He could stop the sun in the sky. He could make a resurrection. He could pull a rabbit out of his hat. Any miracle. God says over there in Deuteronomy 13, and he commands the Jewish people that we are to reject the claim. We are to reject the claim to prophecy, and on the basis, if he tells us to direct devotion to a God that we do not know. In other words, our perception of God, the way we understand God, is the measuring stick. The way we're supposed to understand and measure a claim to prophecy. If a prophet comes along and tells us, "People, I want you to direct your devotion to A, to B, to C," and that A, B, or C that he's asking us to direct our devotion to is not the God that we are familiar with, the God that we know, then we're supposed to reject his claim out of hand, no matter how spectacular of a miracle. He could resurrect a graveyard full of people, and we're still supposed to tell him, "Get lost." In fact, it actually says a step further. We're supposed to put him to death. That's what it says in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 13 clearly says that. So the question now is, on what basis are we supposed to put this prophet or claimant to prophecy to death? On the basis of our perception to God. Maybe our perception of God is wrong. Maybe the way we understand God is flawed and unreliable. why maybe the miracle that the prophet is producing is supposed to tell us, no, our perception of God is really a trinity, as Christians claim, and not a absolute unity, as Jews claim. God is not above and beyond all of nature, but as Jews believe, but rather, as a Christian claims, God somehow manifested himself here within finite existence. Why are we so confident in our perception of God? Now I will point out to you that the passage in Deuteronomy tells us to be confident, and to be so confident with that perception that you should put the performer of miracles to death on the basis of your perception of God. So the answer is very simple. Where did we pick up? Where did the Jewish people get their perception of God? Who taught it to them? Where did it come to them? How did they arrive at this perception? Very simple. God has many messages for the Jewish people. And most of the messages that God sent to the Jewish people, he sent to them through the medium of prophets. He taught many laws through the medium, the agency of Moses. And we know that we're supposed to observe this commandment, to that commandment, and the other commandment, because Moses taught us to do that. And Moses' prophecy was verified by God, as he was a true prophet. And we have the book of Isaiah, because Isaiah told us whatever the message that he had to tell us, in the book of Daniel, etc. But there's one teaching which God himself did not rely on the agency of any prophet, but rather God himself imparted that to the Jewish people as a whole, as a complete national entity. And he taught this teaching to the Jewish people. He didn't rely on written words. He didn't rely on a prophet passing on a message, but rather God made a spectacular demonstration for the Jewish people to teach them one thing, and that is their perception of God, who it is that they are to worship, and by default, who it is they are not to worship. God performed the miracles of the Exodus, turned the river into blood. He split the Red Sea, the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, in front of the entirety of the Jewish nation. God spoke to the Jewish nation from the midst of the fire. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. We heard his voice. The nation of Israel heard his voice. And God introduced himself to the Jewish people. And Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, Moses summarizes this concept by saying, unto you was shown in order that you understand that the Lord is God, there is none else. In other words, God himself taught this to us. So this is a teaching that is not being sent to us through the agency of any prophet, through the agency of any book, but rather God himself taught us this teaching. On the basis of this teaching, God calls us, the Jewish people, his witnesses. This is the primary calling of the Jewish people, to teach the world that all of finite existence is beholden, is subject to the one creator who's above and beyond all finite existence. Our perception of God is the rock solid basis of our relationship with God, of our understanding of God, and that is the rock upon which the Christian claims break, because our perception of God is the rock, is the measuring stick which God points to and tells us, this is what you're supposed to look at. This is what you're supposed to be confident about, and this is what you're supposed to measure any claim to prophecy. And when the Christian claims that Jesus is worthy of our devotion, we know that Jesus lived and breathed as any other human being. So whatever mysterious claims that the Christian wants to say about him, he's somehow one and the same of the God of the Jewish Bible, that's fine and good for the Christian. But the Jew was taught by God who we are to worship and who we are not to worship. We are taught that all of finite existence, everyone who breathes and walks God's earth, is subject and is supposed to direct all of their devotion towards the God who is above and beyond all of nature. And no existence, nothing that exists within nature could point to themselves and say, I am worthy of worship. That is direct contradiction to the teaching that God himself imparted to the Jewish people. So how do we know that Isaiah was a true prophet? Because he conformed, he fit in with the Jewish perception of God as God taught to the Jewish people. To use the book of Isaiah as a proof or as some type of way of getting around to try to disqualify the Jewish understanding of God, which is in essence what the Christian is doing by claiming that the book of Isaiah tells us that Jesus was telling the truth, is a contradiction in terms. It's an absurdity. We only know that Isaiah was a true prophet because he conformed to the Jewish perception of God, and to use him as a contradiction to the Jewish perception of God is the most inherent contradiction that we can ever imagine.